a weekly talk show produced by the SKNIS Information Service, where we provide exclusives with key persons within the government and discuss pertinent, relevant, and interesting matters that affect us all. Tune in every Wednesday, live on ZIZ Radio and streamed live on Facebook at SKNIS Media and ZIZ Online. InFocus, your government, your business.
I'm Ian Richards, welcoming you to InFocus, a weekly program where we take a closer look at what's happening within and across the government of St. Kitts and Nevis, your government. The recently passed pension reforms are reshaping the future for civil servants and government auxiliary workers, or employees, providing equity, security, and dignity for all employees who have contributed to building a prosperous St. Kitts and Nevis. A key feature of the reforms is the elimination of a dual pension system, ensuring a more equitable structure that addresses long-standing disparities faced by GAEs. For civil servants, the reforms introduce choice. Retire at age 55, as is the standard, or opt into the new contributory plan, extending your service up to 62 years if possible, eliminating the need to write for an extension every year. There's quite a bit to consider. With us today to discuss the details of the new pension plan and help you to make an informed decision are Thelma Richard, Head of the Civil Service, and Levi Bradshaw, Accountant General of the Government's Treasury Department. Stay with us for InFocus, your government, your business.
This has brought justice to the GAE workers. This was not an easy bill to put together. Nobody is disadvantaged. If you came in before 2012 and you are leaving, whatever the rules were then, they apply to you. You will still get your pension at the appropriate time. This law alone is going to benefit 10% of our people here in St. Kitts. Over 2,000 people are going to benefit from this. We are guaranteeing that 10% of our working people now get this benefit and will not retire in poverty. This law does not look to whether you are supporting this party or that party. This law covers our workers in this country.
Thanks for staying with us, and those of you who are joining us for this program, you would have just heard the voice of the Honorable Prime Minister, Dr. Terence Drew, as he would have shared some details during the Parliament sitting when the pension plan amendment bill was actually debated and passed. So joining us to discuss some of the details that were shared during the Parliament and what this new pension plan means to civil servants and to government auxiliary workers is, as I mentioned, Ms. Richard, Mr. Bradshaw, welcome to both of you on our program.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ian.
All right, so we're going to jump right into it because, of course, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of questions that persons have, and we want to get as much done as possible. So first off, let's establish the term that we're going to be hearing over and over again, a civil servant and a government auxiliary employee. Can you tell us the difference between the two?
Sure, and it's important that we do that because we do have two categories of workers in. They are our government auxiliary employees, we call them the GAEs, and those are our weekly paid persons. So those persons, their positions are not in what we call the establishment positions. They're not part of the established positions. They're not part of the budget book that comes out on an annual basis listing the positions within government. And then we have our civil servants. They are normally our monthly paid people. Their positions are listed in the budget estimates that's printed annually. Now, we do have a small section of persons who are monthly paid, but they're considered GAEs. We call them our monthly GAEs because even though they are paid and on a monthly basis, they're not in any established positions, or for some reason they could not be appointed to those established positions. So it's important that we clearly define who those persons are.
And it's very important as well too, because most persons don't recognize that in order for you to be appointed to the civil service, there must be a post available in the department.
Correct. And that was critically important before, and it still is important because some people still require that appointment to be a civil servant. But there is a clear distinction between what a GAE is and what a civil servant is.
Right. So could you give us an example of what would be a GAE worker?
We see them every day, Ian. We see them every day. We're probably not sure who they are. So they are the maids in the hospital, the people who clean the drains in our villages, and our parks and beaches workers. The school bus driver who takes our children to school. Those are all within the category of GAEs.
Right. And of course, the Prime Minister described them as the backbone of
Correct.
the civil service. They really
I think we
do.
will know within one day if we're missing some of these people.
All right. Mr. Bradshaw, let's bring you into the conversation now and talk to us a bit about the difference between a pension and a gratuity. Again, those are terms that we are going to be having discussions on during our topic here today.
Thank you, Mr. Richards. Again, a pension is basically paid to persons who are eligible. That is, those persons who would have contributed 15 years of service to the government. Upon their retirement, they would be eligible for a monthly payment from the state. That would be called that their pensions. We would note that you must work in the public service for 15 years in order to be eligible. With the passage of the new bit of legislation, GAE workers who would have worked for 15 years, even prior, some person would have started working many, many years ago. Those years are counted. And they, upon retirement, would receive a monthly income from the state in the form of a pension. As it relates to a gratuity is a gratuitous lump sum payment that is made to a worker, an employee of the who would have contributed 10 continuous years of service, who would have worked for 10 continuous years of service. A rule of thumb is simply this, that if you would have worked for 10 years, your gratuity would be equivalent to 1 year's salary. The gratuity will grow and increase if you would have worked for more years. So any number of years more than 10, as your salary increases and your number of years in the service would have increased, the size of your gratuity, which is that lump sum, would also increase. I would venture to say at this particular point in time, Ian, that the government would have taken that decision, that the gratuity that is paid to all category of government pensioners, all category of government workers, persons who have contributed 10 years, is computed using the same formula. There is no segregation, there is no distinction, there is equity. Every government employee who would have contributed 10 years of service to our country's development are eligible for a pension, are eligible for a gratuity. And that gratuity is paid in a lump sum to you. The computation, I want to emphasize this, it is the same computation. So the category of workers that Thelma would have spoken to, our school bus drivers, their gratuity will be computed using the same formula as our nurses.
And that would be a gross pay, it would be the gross pay that you receive.
Yes, it will be gross pay, and there's a particular formula. So we will basically move now to compute your number of months of service. So we'll break down your service down to months. That will be divided by what we refer to as a constant, 600, and you multiply that by your annual income, and that will determine what your gratuity is. Again, that is the basic formula. You'll see a different formula if you go through the legislation, but the outcome is the same. But the rule of thumb, number of months divided by 600 times your annual income.
Right. Okay. All right. So before we get now into a bit of the pension reform plans that was actually passed, we want to talk a bit about your roles and your responsibilities in designing and helping to shape what is, of course, the Prime Minister was leading on this matter. He's very passionate about the issue, ensuring, as I mentioned before, that there is equity and that there is that security that persons enjoy. So can you tell us about your involvement in the pension reform initiative of the government of St. Kitts and Nevis?
I'm going to allow Mr. Bradshaw to go first.
Ian, it has been a privilege of my service to this country. I've been associated with this particular initiative. I've observed and I've worked very closely with this process since its inception. you'll recall that in 2005, the government would have started on this particular path. And one of the chief architects of this exercise, of this initiative, was Mr. Joseph Edmeade, who was a former cabinet secretary and head of the public service. Now the government of St. Kitts and Nevis would have passed some legislation in 2012. Two bits of legislation was passed. One was a GAA Act that is giving legal recognition to the weekly paid employees who we previously referred to as non-established workers. But on the 18th of May, in 2012 as well, this significant bit of legislation, the amendment to the Pension Act, was passed. Now that act was not brought into force. But I would have had the opportunity to serve on the Pensions Committee, chaired by Mr. Elvis Newton, our former head of the public service, head of the civil service of blessed memory. And he would have led that exercise from 2012 coming forward. He would have been succeeded by Ms. Torfida Rochester,
right,
who was also a former head of the Human Resource Department, Chief Personnel Officer. And she would have led, and she subsequently passed the baton on to myself. And I would have assumed leadership and chair of the Pensions Reform Committee in 2020. And subsequent to 2020, I had the privilege of sharing and passing that baton on to my colleague here, Ms. Thelma Richards, who is now the chair of the Pensions Reform Task Force. So a number of persons would have contributed to this particular initiative over the years. And I'm so proud that we are at this particular point, that I can face a number of these persons who are now eligible to say that the work has been done. Upon your retirement, you will receive a pension. You can now retire with dignity. You don't have to be at the mercy of anyone. You have contributed to the growth and development of this country. And having made a significant contribution, you're now eligible for a pension. So I'm really, really proud for my contribution, but not myself, because it was a team and a number of persons who participated in the exercise, and they too must be recognized as well.
Right, and the term government auxiliary worker, you use the term non-established worker. I just remembered that. It's like, that sounded so outdated, so second class, a non-established worker, as opposed to a government auxiliary employee.
Yeah, and you're fully aware of our history and the segregation and the various charters that would have existed in class systems. And so what we refer to as civil servants were part of the established public service. And we had that category of workers who did meaningful work. We tend to disregard these people because they are low-wage earners, but their contribution to the sustenance of our country, the growth and development of our country, is critical. And I'm really happy that the government would have taken the initiative in 2012 to reclassify them, change that name from non-established. Right. They are now government auxiliary employees.
Right. Okay, Ms. Richard, talk to us a bit about your involvement in the Pension Reform Initiative.
Well, I did not go back as far as Mr. Bradshaw here, but however, when I did begin my tenure in government, that's one of the first things that Mrs. Whitaker was the Chief Personnel Officer at the time, and I would say she threw me into the deep end. So we started that discussion since then with Mr. Newton, Mrs. Rochester, and Mrs. Whitaker. As Mr. Bradshaw was just explaining about the change in the name for NEs, any workers, which they hated, to GAE workers. That was a very significant milestone for the government at that time. We did a series of information sessions in the park. We spoke to every single GAE by ministry would have changed, and it's not only a name change, Ian, it was a change to their circumstances of work. For the first time, they were also granted paid vacation leave. So it came with a lot of other benefits that they did not previously have, because there was a constant call that they be made equal to civil servants, that they do work that is as important as a civil servant. So it was very important at that time, and that was the start of the conversation of making them equal to and ensuring that they too, when they leave, receive a gratuity and a pension.
Right. Okay. And talk to us a bit about the difference now in terms of the legal framework, the legal framework that would govern the administration of public sector pensions.
The administration of public sector pension in St. Kitts and Nevis is basically governed by two pieces of legislation. The first being the Parent Act, which is the Pensions Act Cap 22.06. That was passed and amended many, many years ago. And that is the Parent Act, where most of what we refer to as established civil servants would fall under. Those persons who would have been employed prior to the 18th day of May 2012 would fall under that particular act. The government would have executed another bit of legislation, and that is the Pensions Amendment Act. Now that the Parent Act was amended twice. It was amended in 2012, and it was not brought into force for a number of reasons. But I'm happy that the reconfiguration and the changes that were made, this is now a better piece of legislation. So the recently passed act, that is the Pensions Amendment Act of 2025, which was passed on the 30th day of April this year, and was assented to by the Governor General, Her Excellency, on the 1st day of May. That is the new bit of legislation. I would always say to my colleagues that the legislation that governs your employment in the public service, you must have a copy of it. Every GAE should venture and strive to get their hands on a copy of the Pensions Amendment Act. Likewise, every civil servant should have a copy of the Pensions Act, Cap 22.06. I will venture to say as well that there are two other bits of legislation that persons must have, because there's a rule of law, a law which speaks specifically to government auxiliary employees. That was passed in 2012. That speaks to your terms and conditions of employment. You must have a copy of that. And there's a Public Service Act, again, that is Cap 20, I think it's 22.09. Again, get your hand on that. You must have those bits of legislation, because in those two bits of legislation, it specifically outlines who are eligible for benefits under those. So let me speak quickly to the original act. Persons who are eligible for a gratuity and pension under the original Cap 2206 would be those persons who are employed prior to the 18th day of May 2012. If you would have worked for 10 years or more, you're entitled to gratuity. If you would have worked for 15 continuous years or more, you are eligible for a pension. Now, at the amendment which was recently passed, it brought into consideration another two categories of workers primarily. That is those public officers who were employed on or after the 18th day of May. They are now eligible for a pension under this act. The second category of workers is our government auxiliary employees. They are now eligible for a pension and gratuity under the amendment. Now, the amendment would have also made provisions for persons who are employed and who were employed prior to 2012, but who would now choose, and you emphasize the point in your opening, who would now make that personal decision whether I want to participate in the new act. Now, why would one want to participate? It allows for an additional number of years of service to the state. So rather than the compulsory retirement age of 55, you can now work to 62. Now, the two pensions that are administered and managed under these two bits of legislation can be simply described. One is a contributory type pension, and one is a non-contributory type pension. So originally, the Parent Act is a non-contributory pension, where persons would have, having qualified, met the eligibility criteria, would have been eligible for a pension upon retirement and a gratuity as well. Without contributing, the state would have carried the full burden. The amendment would have brought into play now a contributory mechanism where persons who are now eligible for employment, eligible for a pension and a gratuity under the Pensions Amendment Act would now have to contribute towards their pension.
Right, and let me stop you there, because of course we're going to get a bit more into the contributions and the differences between the old and the new plan, pension plans, as we begin the discussion. But there's something that you mentioned that I wanted to touch on as well too. You mentioned in terms of getting your hands on the act. I think it's important that we inform persons that the amendment bills, and there are no acts, because of course they would have been passed by the Parliament, and as you mentioned, ascended by Her Excellency Dame Marcella. They are available on sknis.gov.kn, which is the website of the St. Kitts and Nevis Information Service. And the older acts that you mentioned, they can be found on lawcommission.gov.kn. I think that's important for persons to go there and get their hands on the acts that you mentioned. Okay, so let's Ms. Richards, come to you in terms of And Mr. Bradshaw hinted at it, but let's roll the clock back a bit in terms of, let's say it's January 2022. What is the current policy regarding the payment of a pension and a gratuity to civil servants as opposed to a government auxiliary employee?
Okay, I'm going to roll the clock back a bit further than that. I'm rolling it back to prior to May 18, 2012.
You're cranking up that time machine.
Yes, because it is important. May 18, 2012 was a significant period. So prior to that time, GAEs were not entitled to either a gratuity or a pension payment. In May 18, 2012, prior to May 18, 2012, only civil servants received a gratuitous payment and a pension once they would have met the minimum criteria. Now, May 18, 2012 is when we would have first updated the Pension Act to say that we are now considering, or we will now grant a pension and a gratuity to civil servants and to persons employed after May 18, 2012. So that is why that date is so significant. So what the GAEs were awarded prior to that time was what we call a compassionate gratuity. That's it. It was a formula that was something that would, give you something very small upon your leave from government. It was not significant, but it was to say that we acknowledge your time with the government and we are going to give you a compassionate payment. But a gratuity did not exist for GAEs at the time.
Okay, and so as we mentioned, and as Mr. Bradshaw would have talked about, let's talk a bit about the key differences between the old pension plan and the new pension plan. What's important for civil servants and GAEs to know?
Okay, so the old pension plan is part of what we call a non-contributory pension plan. And I would again re-emphasize the point that under that particular plan, someone who would have worked for 10 continuous years would have qualified themselves for a gratuity. Someone who would have worked for 15 continuous years would have qualified themselves for a pension. I would suggest, though, that if those 15 years we started counting from age 18. As a boy, when most of us left care in high school, we had 3 choices. The boys had 2, the girls had 3. So we could have gone to teach or become a policeman. The ladies had the additional option of being a nurse in those days. They were no male nurses. Not many of us for 17 years. Many guys would have joined the police force at age 17. That year up to your 18th birthday is not counted in the computation of your benefits. Now, under the old Act as well, the retirement age is 55 years. And at 55, you can retire. There were some provisions that were made for persons who could have requested an additional year, and that was subject to the approval of your permanent secretary and the Human Resource Management Department.
And the Public Service Commission.
And the Public Service Commission as well. And then, under the old plan, there were 2 types of pension and gratuity, something we call full pension and gratuity, and something we refer to as reduced pension and gratuity. So now what is full pension and gratuity, and what is reduced pension and gratuity? You would have qualified for a full pension and gratuity if you would have met the eligibility criteria for a pension, which is 15 years.
And does that have to be unbroken service or continuous service?
Continuous service.
Okay.
And so I'm talking full now, 15 years, but less than 25. So 15 years, 11 months and days, less than 25. You must qualify. That is one of the criteria for full pension. Service, less than 25 years, 15 to 24, 11. And you must be younger than 50 years. So if you would have served 21 years of service, but you are 51, you do not qualify for full pension and gratuity. So that is one. Reduced pension and gratuity is paid to persons who would have worked for in excess of 25 years of service, or would have exceeded the age of 50. Now, pension under the old rules would have paid if you would have worked for 15 years, you become pensionable, and the pension is payable if you would have retired before your 50th birthday. Pension is paid at age 50. If you continue to work on and on, then your retirement age, and you reach the mandatory retirement age of 55, having attained that age and you would have contributed to 15 years of service, then your pension is paid at age 55.
Right.
If you would have worked for 25 years or more, and you leave before your 55th birthday, the fact that you've served for 25 years, your pension will commence immediately. So let me walk back those quickly. That under the reduced pension, if you would have served for 15 years, but less than 25, your pension will be paid to you upon your 50th birthday if you are not yet 50. If you would have served for 25 years, continuous years, in the public service and you're not yet 50. In other words, if you started at 20 and you're 45, but you work for 25 years, you can start getting pension immediately at age 45. And the last model, if you would have continued to work throughout the service until retirement, you retired at 55, you receive your gratuity and retire and your pension at age 50. So that is the old plan. The new plan now would have extended the category of workers who are eligible, those GAE workers, those persons who are employed or who were employed after 2012, the 18th of May. This is a category of workers that prior to the passage of this bit of legislation were not entitled to a retirement pension. Under the new bit of legislation, they are now eligible for a pension. So if they would have served 15 continuous years, they are now eligible for a pension. But the change for the new pension act is not, or the pension is now paid at age 62. So you can work until you're 62, and that is when the pension is paid under the new plan. Now, you know, I've been around for a long time, Ian. I mean, I remember your school, we spoke a bit there, you know, and I've seen many of my colleagues in the public service who have contributed immensely to the growth of our country, work hard as teachers, nurses and other professions, and would have retired at age 55. Now at age 55, if you met all the maximum contributions in terms of the number of years of service, you're entitled to what we refer to as the maximum pension. You'll have contributed 33 1/3 years of service, 400 months. The maximum pension is half of your salary. Half of your salary is 50%.
At that time when you retire?
And even now, that is what the rule is. Persons on the old pension act, you get 50% of your pension. But you are leaving at age 55.
Right.
Now many of my friends would have left at age 55. But at 55, your income, unless you have alternative sources of income or a job to walk into, you're basically saying to yourself that I'm prepared to retire and survive on half of my income. Now, if you would have planned, the mortgage is already taken care of, the children are out of school, out of university, the wife is still working, that's a personal decision that you will have to make. But I want to emphasize the point that when you retire at 50, your disposable income has been reduced by as much as 50% or more. I've seen colleagues who would have fallen on hard times.
Yes.
Because of that decision. And that 7 years wait before the Social Security would have chipped in. Those have been difficult times, and many of us would have observed that. The new bit of legislation now provides for persons who would have qualified under the old Pension Act, that is the Pension Act Cap 22.06, to opt in to the new. Now, Ian, you know, I say Ian because I was in the system, but Mr. Richards, with respect, that is a deeply personal decision. You must decide how this will affect you. Your friend's circumstance is different to yours. You must give serious consideration, talk to your spouse, discuss with your family, seek guidance where you can find it. Ensure that when I decide to opt in, it is the best decision for me.
Right.
Because opting in is suggesting to you now that when I opt in, because I'm 55, I'm opting in, I'm 43 and I've taken the decision to opt in because I look at my mortgage, it won't end until the next 15 years or 16, 20 years, so I need a full-time job. Your pension will now be paid at your 62nd birthday. That is the age of retirement. That is when pension will start. Your gratuity will be paid immediately upon retirement, but the difference is that pension will not be paid until your 62nd birthday. Now that 62nd birthday in our country would tie into where Social Security is currently.
Right.
Where the Social Security retirement age is 62.
Currently, yes.
Now, our computation has shown that Social Security, if you would have met the maximum contributions under the scheme, is equivalent to 60% of your earnings. And the government now, under this new plan, is offering you 40% pension. 40 plus 60 is 100%. In other words, you will be made whole upon retirement at 60.
You maintain the salary that you
maintain the income.
Or the wage, yes,
the earnings
right.
that you would have earned prior to retirement at age 60. But that is a personal decision.
Yes.
I cannot make it for you. And my job here today is not to tell you to choose one or the other. It is a personal choice.
Right, and we're going to come back again to talk a bit more about that, Ms. Richard. Of course, I would want you to weigh in. But I want to go back just a bit in terms of the GAEs. Now, the Prime Minister, he mentions that it promotes equity for GAEs. Ms. Richard, can you explain how so?
Well, that one is actually very easy. We have gone for the GAEs from 0 to 100. You know, they were in a system where they did not receive anything. And we've now introduced a system where they're not just getting something, but they're getting the same as their counterpart, the civil servant. So it's saying to them that the calculation used to prepare a gratuity and a pension for a doctor is same for me as the drain cleaner. It's the same formula that is used. What's plugged in is our years of service and our salary at the time. Mm-hmm. But yes, it is considered equitable. We have done away with the dual system of pension systems, and created one system that now covers both GAE and civil servants.
Right, and talk to us a bit about that dual system. And Mr. Bradshaw, I see you want to weigh in, but just a minute, in terms of that dual system, what was that like?
The dual system was introduced in 2012 by that same legislation on May 18th. So before that, we just had the one for civil servants alone. In May 18th, 2012, we introduced another system that would grant gratuity and pension to the GAE and civil servants hired after that time. So what Mr. Bradshaw and the team did, along with Cabinet, we came together to come up with how can we make this more equitable, because what we have was two systems and one seeming to be better than the other. So what we sought to do is ensure equity, and that is my buzzword, Ian, for this entire Pension Act. What we sought to do is ensure equity, and we decided that one Pension Act to govern all civil servants and GAEs was the way to go. So that was the decision taken, and that is why we are here before you today to speak about the new plan that is an inclusive plan.
Right, and it removes that term compassion. You don't have to rely on compassion.
Correct.
You are rewarded for the work that you put in.
And you've been in the system longer than me, so if you recall what compassionate gratuity was, it is if that PS liked you and they write in for you to get that compassionate gratuity. But we had too many too many GAEs who left the system not even receiving that compassionate gratuity, and that has removed PSs from the equation. This is clearly on what you did. What was your service? Did you meet the minimum service requirements of 15 years? If that is yes, it has nothing to do with the PS. The decision is put before the PSC and before the Governor General, and you are granted that gratuity and pension.
Mr. Bradshaw?
Yeah, I just wanted to, just to support Thelma's response and just to draw our memory back. I would have indicated earlier that there were two amendments to the Pension Act. One was in 2012, that was not brought into force. That was a strictly defined benefit type pensions arrangement where a contributory type pension plan would have been introduced. It was not brought into force. But what that plan was really asking for was that the employee would match the contribution of the employee. You put 3%, your employee would put 3%. And if you do the computation, you choose to do the computation, I would have worked for 10 years, and my salary was $1,000 per month, $12,000. You do your own math.
Yeah.
But the point is, 3% of your contribution, your employer's contribution, is less than 50% of an annual salary that you are now eligible for if you retire 10 years.
And if you use the same figures that you gave, that will only be $30. Right.
So in other words, the contribution that an individual would have made into the scheme, matched by that of the employer, I think we would have attempted to solve the problem, but it would have been something that is not good. Now the government would have reviewed the legislation and would have taken into account the reality. And I mean, the Prime Minister was strong on this particular point. I mean, he made the point that if we are asking persons to contribute, this category of worker, and there are another category of workers who are eligible, are entitled by law, by right, for a pension and gratuity, but have not paid any contribution, then there must be equity. Why should the person who is contributing get a benefit that is less than the person who is not? Both are by law. And we would have taken the decision, and the cabinet would have supported the recommendation, and it was approved in the parliament, that in the event as it relates to the gratuity, the same formula will be used for all categories of workers. That is equity.
Right. Okay. And so you mentioned the contribution of 3%. Why was it necessary to have that contribution added to the pension plan?
Ian, we live in a small island state. We recognize, we all listen to the news. We are all aware that these are, times we live very close to our neighbor to the north. And in reality, the matter of sustainability must be considered and given serious consideration. So we had a pension plan that was a non-contributory pension plan. I never paid a cent into the plan. I would have contributed to this country 39 years of my life. And I'm allowed now to leave with a gratuitous payment and a pension. I've never paid a cent into the plan. Now, if I'm at the age level to opt in, then I might be required to pay towards the plan. But my pension, as of today, it's a non-contributory pension. However, another person will have to pay because of the timeline and the new act. And the reason for that is the whole idea of sustainability. Funding pension is a serious obligation of the government, and the pension has been paid over the years out of the consolidated fund fully, 100%. Under the new arrangement, pension now will be paid from the consolidated fund. But there would be resources that are now available out of the pension fund that can contribute towards the gratuity and pension of government employees.
Right.
Again, the percentage of the state's contribution towards the pension is substantial. We are just contributing 3%, but we are entitled to a full gratuity, computed equitably across the board, and a pension using the new formula.
Right. And Ms. Richard, there are some 2,000 GAEs who are benefiting under this program.
Yes, that's correct, Ian. So those 2,000 GAEs that's the number that we pulled from what we call the ITMS that Mr. Bradshaw manages. So that would tell us the number of GAEs that are currently eligible or immediately eligible for the pension. You wanted me to talk about the 2,000? So the 2,000 persons that are eligible now. So not eligible now, that are in the system now. So these persons, when they retire, will receive a gratuity and a pension once they meet the minimum qualifications. Now we also have an additional 200. So those 200 GAEs were actually awarded a pension in 2024. They are already receiving a pension. Those persons would have retired. We recognize that they would have given their service minimum years of 15 years, but they would not have fallen under the old plan or the new plan. So we had to find a way to award them. So the decision was taken in 2024, and near 200 persons were awarded the pension as of 2024.
With the option for persons to retire and live in dignity, and of course we all want to live in dignity as we get older, and sometimes there's something else that we want to do as well. And having that pension when I pursue other things, because just because I'm retired doesn't mean I have to work. It just means I'm retired from giving my service to the government. Is there a concern that there's going to be a mass exodus of persons leaving the service now that I can retire and I can go on to pursue my dreams? Someone mentioned that I can go on a cruise. Is there that concern?
Not for me. I know I have a number of GAEs. They come to the Human Resource Management Department all the time, and they have been waiting for this in. They have been asking year after year because they are now 62 and they want to wait. And we have not asked any person to retire, any GAE to retire, because we know that this was coming, and we wanted to make sure that when they retire, they have something to take home with them. So those persons, they can now take that step and send in their resignation. So we know who they are, we know who the persons are who qualify at this time for a pension. And we do have some people who are just waiting on us for that payment or for the processing. So we have seen some, but we know the numbers will not be that we have to be concerned about. And we are pleased to actually be able to pay pension and gratuity to these GAEs who have been waiting.
And so you don't have to work until you're 70, until you're 75.
Not if you don't want to.
Your service.
Not if you don't want to.
Right.
And again, that's why we say it's a personal decision. When you retire, whether you want to go back into the world of work in the private sector, or if you have that passion that you want to pursue, or if you have a side hustle. A lot of them have a side hustle, Ian, so they can make that decision. But if the other person don't have that side hustle, then you have to possibly think about it and make a different decision.
Who manages that 3%, Mr. Bradshaw?
Okay, yeah, and before you go to the 3%, I just want to add a bit to what Thelma would have indicated, that since the passage of the Act on the assent of the Act on the 1st of May, at the Treasury we have already started computing gratuity for persons who have retired since last year.
Approximately 50 GAEs.
And we would have done
actually.
56 actually.
Okay.
56
yes.
GAE employees who would have left the public service up from January 1st, 2024, would have received the redefined, what we call now a long service gratuity. Thelma would have indicated that the state would have moved away from paying the compassionate gratuity. But the long service gratuity is not a full gratuity. We have done the computation, and for those 56 persons, they would have received the long service. We did the computation, it's at about $1.7 million we have computed in gratuity for those 56 persons. Now it doesn't mean that having computed Thelma's gratuity on the new plan, that she will get
an additional
the amount that we computed, because remember she was given some before. But each of those persons are entitled to an additional amount. And what we are doing is to ensure that they are not cheated, they are not deprived of their benefits. They would have contributed to the growth of our country. And the law now states that they are eligible for pension to be computed and gratuity to be computed using this formula. We have done the computation, and we are doing those that are coming to our office from HR to ensure that the computation is done, so they can get the difference, what their true gratuity should have been, and the long service that was paid prior. But in response to your question about the 3%, the management of the pensions portfolio in large measure is done by the Office of the Accountant General, the Treasury Department. We are the ones who have oversight. We manage the pensions payroll, and in managing the pension payroll, the law under the amendment has given that authority to us, to basically be responsible for managing the pension deductions that are made from the income of persons and finding mechanisms for investing that. Because there is a category of employees who would now be eligible for a refund out of the pension fund, not a pension, not a gratuity. Because what we are indicating that what we have collected in the pension fund by way of deduction is not sufficient to pay your full gratuity and your full pension. The state has to meet the difference. However, if an individual, having served for 9 years, would have chosen to leave the public service for his own reasons, whatever the reasons are, because he would not have reached the time frame of service of 10 years, where he would have been qualified for a gratuity, his contributions for that 9-year period, plus an element of interest, would be funded to him. So until you meet the qualifying criteria, the eligibility criteria for a gratuity, your contribution into the pension fund would be refunded to you if you leave. If you choose to go beyond 10 years, then, as I said before, what you contribute is not sufficient to cover your gratuity, even for. So, I think, and that speaks to equity, that speaks to fairness, that speaks to, good pension management planning. If I have to leave, I have not at least met the threshold for a gratuity, then my contribution should be repaid to me.
Okay, there's just about 14 minutes left if you would be leaving this program. So let's talk a bit about the opt-in option. And you would have made it quite clear, Mr. Bradshaw, in terms of how it works. So, Ms. Richard, I'll ask you then, for persons who are deciding whether they should opt in or remain on the plan, what are civil servants, of course, we're talking about, what are some of the key factors that they should consider before they make that decision?
And not just civil servants, Ian. This is for civil servants hired before May 18, 2012.
Right.
Those are the civil servants who are given that option, a choice of whether they want to remain on the old system and retire at age 55 or opt into the new system and have the new retirement age of 62. What they should consider, a lot of things, but it's personal decision. So they will have to consider, where am I financially? Because if I choose to retire at 55, will I be able to meet my financial commitments? When I retire at 55, everything for me that I had under the old plan remains, but will I have the option of another job, another income? So that has to be considered by the civil servant. The gratuity formula, that does not change, so I have that benefit going into the new plan. My pension will now kick in at 62. It now matches to Social Security, so there is no longer that 7-year delay. There's no longer asking annually for an extension of service beyond 55 and going to the doctor each year and hoping you get that extension, because that extension, Ian, is not guaranteed. So under the new plan, once you opt in, age 62 is now your guaranteed age of retirement.
And of course, that also depends on the personality of the person you're dealing with.
And that's why we say all the time to people, we emphasize it. I don't think, Mr. Bradshaw, we could emphasize it more than we did in the last 7 sessions which we had, is that it is a personal decision. Your decision, Ian, is very different from mine, very different from Mr. Bradshaw's. We all are in our individual positions and must really think about where we are and make that decision, and not an emotional one. Make an intelligent decision based on where you are financially. Whether I want to work until 62 and then get my payment of a pension from government that matches the same time with Social Security, or whether or not I'm ready to leave at 55 and I do not want to extend beyond that time.
Yes, and pursue other goals, of course.
Yes.
Ian, I just speak to the whole idea of opt-in. Thelma, maybe you can expound a little bit on what is the mechanism, because the law provides for a clear mechanism for those persons who were employed prior to the 18th of May 2012 to opt in. In other words, you elect to. And in electing to opt in, there's a mechanism that speaks to the form. So Thelma.
Yes. So opting in is a choice. Choice has deadlines. So the opt-in deadline is June 30th. So that decision to opt in must be made and the form must be submitted to the Human Resource Management Department, Ian, by June 30th. The form must be signed by an oath officer at the courthouse. So they have to witness and sign to say that this is indeed your choice and your decision. This makes it legal. You bring that form to Human Resources. We will keep that on file for you to ensure that we know that this is your choice and how we will operate going forward for you.
How do you respond to persons who say that June 30th, it's, as you mentioned, a very personal decision? There are a lot of factors to consider, that deadline is a bit too soon.
Yes, we've heard the cries of the deadline being too soon, but this legislation was heard in Parliament on May 30th, and it was gazetted on the 1st, I believe, of June. April 30th, and gazetted on the 1st of May. And the decision was taken that the officers will be given a 2-month period to make that decision. We understand the difficulty in saying that it is a short period, but it is officially law, and it's not something that we can change tomorrow. So we ask them to be diligent, speak to their financial advisors, their banks, whoever they need to speak with, and try and come up with the best decision for themselves. We are all faced with the same decision. This is not a deadline for one particular category of employee, but for anyone who was hired before 2012, May 18, 2012.
Now, of course, the government and the HR department, of course, has organized a number of discussion series where persons are brought in and they're basically given a rundown of how the new system works, basically what you're doing here today. What has that feedback been like?
We have had excellent feedback. Let me go back to the number of sessions. We have had 5 sessions with civil servants, and we have had 2 sessions with the GAEs. And so civil servants prior to May 2012 and all GAEs. We had excellent feedback from our GAEs. They welcome the change. They now feel that they are valued and that their service counts the same as any other person. Of course, from our pre-2012 civil servants, it's a change, and everyone struggles sometimes with change. One of the biggest concerns, as you shared, Ian, is the change is a time frame, the short time frame that is given to make the decision. So we would have shared with them, as we shared with you, that time is made in law, that date was made in law and cannot be changed by us. And we would have urged them to make a decision on their personal choices and their personal space, and not on what their friends or someone sitting in a cubicle next to them are saying. But I think overall we did have some questions, and we were there and we made ourselves available to answer any questions, and we still remain available. Human Resources is available, the Treasury Department is available, and we will continue to share information and update the civil servants and GAEs alike as we go forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, looking forward, Mr. Bradshaw, of course, there are some persons who would prefer, it's a traditional habit. I think it goes all the way back to customs when, persons used to work on their plantations and stuff, that they put their money under their bed, that they prefer to have their money where they can reach it. Now, that has translated to modern times where we put our money on our bank accounts, where we know it's there and it's safe. It's not doing anything. Now, the ECCB has already said that in the region, throughout the ECCU, that is what they are seeing. They are seeing persons with very good savings. But the problem is that the money is just sitting there. It's not being made to work to persons. Is there an opportunity that the government would consider using the Treasury Department partnering with some private stakeholders, or however it may be designed, where persons, civil servants, GAEs, can be informed in terms of investments, learn what the opportunities are, consider of putting their money to actually work for them? Of course, there are safe investments that can be made, treasury bonds, treasury bills, those sort of different things, as opposed to, say, a stock market, which some persons may not understand. But is there an opportunity and a consideration given where this can be introduced, where persons can put their money to work for them?
Indeed, Ian, the government would have just recently opened up the opportunity for the general public to subscribe for, apply for treasury bills. We have not issued treasury bills in quite a while, and there has been a tremendous demand for treasury bills by our local community. So in April, May this year, we issued applications for interested persons to apply for the 182-day T-bill and the 365-day T-bills. The interest rate on those T-bills, the 182, is 3.85%, and the 365-day T-bill is 4%. Now that is substantially more than the 2% maximum that we'll earn in the banking system, and the 0% that you'll earn if you leave it home under the bed. Mm-hmm. Now, it means therefore that persons will have to really give some deep consideration to financial planning. And financial planning ought not to start upon retirement. In my view, that is too late. Your productive life, your working life, 19, 18 years to 62. I mean, you should design a plan. The young person who is starting out their new job, just finished university, I'm just about to start. I just finished technical college, I'm just about to start. I've just finished CFBC. Start, put up a savings plan in place where you can develop, you do the banking system, you save, and then you look for opportunities to invest. And the government offers opportunities to invest. The threshold that was previously set for treasury bills to enter is, I think it's 20,000. Now, 20,000 is out of money.
That's out of the reach of some persons.
And that is out of the reach of a number of persons. And we are seriously considering making the decision to reduce that to $5,000. So come the issue in August, for example, if we get the necessary approvals from our principals, then that decision will be taken that the minimum investment in treasury bills is $5,000. Now, treasury bills should not be the domain of the well-to-do. Ordinary people like ourselves should be able to invest in treasury bills and have something set aside for our estate, for our children, you know, to support them when they decide to go off to university, to use as security at the point in time when we want to build our homes and so forth. So I would strongly encourage that. And likewise, you know, the government is seriously considering issuing bonds, you know, different. We are in consultation with our counterpart at the central bank, for example, with respect to issuing what we call a retail bond for ordinary people, setting a low entry threshold so you can come in at 5,000 and increase by multiples maybe of 100, so 5,100, you know what I mean?
Right.
And offer you an interest rate that is more than market and that is attractive that you can invest, but provide you with an opportunity to earn and start the whole idea of wealth creation.
Yes. Right.
Which is very important.
And again, that watchword comes back, equity. It's not just out of the reach for some persons, but bringing it down so that every ordinary man in St. Kitts and Nevis has that opportunity, or woman, of course, in St. Kitts and Nevis has that opportunity to make an investment where they can benefit. And I really like that idea. But Miss Richard, in terms of training now, is that something that HR will look at? Because, of course, we have the Aspire program, which is training our young children in school. What about the adults? What about their parents?
Thank you for asking that question, and I am pleased to say that we would have held our first retirement forum this year, and we have another one scheduled to take place in June. So this forum we would have shared tips for retiring and for planning, because we recognize that people are retiring unprepared. So we are trying to make sure that you're getting ready for that time that when you retire. So we had sessions around financial planning and financial health, mental health, physical health, you know, getting ready for the life after work. So we continue to listen and recognize what those needs are, and we try to fill what those gaps are. So we want people to keep looking and listening for when we announce the next retirement forum.
Yeah, if we can add, just as it relates to the investment opportunities, I think we at the Ministry of Finance as well, we are giving serious consideration for the issuing of what we would want to describe as a diaspora optional bond, giving opportunities as well to our citizens who live in the diaspora to invest and generate opportunities for wealth creation and wealth generation in our own country. So that's another instrument that we are also thinking about offering to the public for subscription.
Quickly, and there's just about under a minute left in our program, but how do you envision, Mr. Bradshaw, the change in pension reform impacting the economy and overall quality of life here in St. Kitts and Nevis?
Yeah, that's a very, very easy question. You know, that's the easiest question I've had today. You had me sweating all day. But, you know, under this new plan, an individual who is eligible for a pension and receiving a pension would reduce his dependence on the state for support. You have now the opportunity to continue to earn an income upon leaving the public service, so you can provide for your own needs, contribute in a meaningful way to the good development of our country. So this particular decision provides, and you will get a gratuity, which is a lump sum. In many cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars for some people. In many cases, several thousands of dollars. So you now have that lump sum that you can make certain investments that you have been delaying. You know, I think I'm retiring, but I want to buy certain appliances or do some work on the house with that. And those are stuff that can impact on the economy. But I don't want to make this point before time elapses, Ian. There's another category of gratuity which we refer to as the debt gratuity, where even if you would have worked and for some reason, you know, the master would have called you home to take up additional duty, your gratuity does not disappear. Your estate, your family is still entitled to what we refer to as your debt gratuity. Now the debt gratuity can be accessed in a number of ways. And if we had time, Thelma would have explained. But what I will endeavor for you to do is to encourage our workers to take the opportunity to complete
the form
and affidavit, granting approval to the Accountant General to pay my gratuity to who I choose.
The beneficiary.
My selected beneficiary. If it's my spouse and I have 2 children, I can say 50% for my spouse of my gratuity and 25% each for my grandchildren, my children, or 5% for my first grandchild, because they named the child after me, Levi.
Right.
So it's important, because I say one more thing, Ian. At the Treasury, if you don't put those things in place, you'll have to go to the court system to get a letter of administration. The check will be issued to the estate of Ian. If there's conflict in the family, the money stays at the Treasury. And there's hundreds of thousands of dollars in gratuity at the Treasury in the name of a number of persons who I work with, but there's no decision, there's no agreement with respect to how the funds can be accessed by the families.
Right. Unfortunately, money seems to bring out the worst of persons when it comes to death, and that really should be a time when persons come together, and it should not be a part of squibbling and squabbling. But unfortunately, we are out of time. It seems like, Ms. Richard, we need a part 2 for this discussion. So
we're ready when you are, Ian.
Absolutely. I'd like to thank you. In the meantime, Ms. Richard, Mr. Bradshaw, thank you very much for joining us for this edition of InFocus. And quickly, for persons who'd like to learn more about the options, how can they do so?
The opting in option, there will be a form circulated to all the ministries, and it's also available at the Human Resource Management Department. If the decision is to opt in, make sure you complete that and submit it to the Human Resource Management Department before June 30th, 2025.
All right, so thank you very much, Ms. Richard. Mr. Bradshaw, for joining us for this edition of InFocus, and we'd like to thank you, viewers and listeners, for being with us as well. We trust that you will join us next week at the same place at the same time for another edition of InFocus. I'm Ian Richards. Remember, it's your government, your business.
Join us every Wednesday for InFocus, a weekly talk show produced by the St. Kitts Nevis Information Service, where we provide exclusives with key persons within the government and discuss pertinent, relevant, and interesting matters that affect us all. Tune in every Wednesday, live on ZIZ Radio and streamed live on Facebook at SKNIS Media and ZIZ Online. InFocus, your government, your business.